Okay, everyone, in this project, we're going to be using ChatGPT 4, so the GPT model, in order to create this SQL generator. So this is going to be cool. We're going to be able to save our messages up here in the chat, and then we're going to display the final outcome to the SQL query we asked it to write in the little code section below. So that's what I'm going to be doing. As you can see here, we can scroll through all our previous chats, and we can also clear the chat. Today's video is sponsored by Brydge. Brydge's founders got frustrated by losing data whenever their IoT devices went offline, so they built Brydge, a new IoT SDK that uses BLE to provide 100% data uptime for IoT projects, so you don't lose data when your internet goes down. And guess what? To celebrate their launch, Brydge is giving away free ESP32s to the first 500 people who pre-register for a free trial. That's right, you can get your hands on a free ESP32 just by trying out their platform. And the best part, you get to keep the ESP32 even if you don't continue after the trial. This offer is only available until May 15, so don't miss out. Head over to www.brydge.dev right now and be one of the first lucky 500 to secure your free ESP32. And for those watching after May 15th, you can still check out this awesome SDK and what it has to offer via the link in the description below. Okay, so I hope you're excited. We're going to be building this in TypeScript for the front end and Node.js for the back end, as well as using the OpenAI API's chat completions endpoint. Okay, so let's do it. Let's create a SQL generator in TypeScript with a Node.js backend. So all I'm going to do is select a new project, and this is going to be a TypeScript project. So I can go ahead and click here and make it a TypeScript project by selecting this right here. So that's all I'm going to do. And let's go ahead and call this TypeScript SQL Generator and hit create. Okay, so that will essentially spin up a TypeScript project for me. So let's just go ahead and wait for that to do its thing. If you're not using WebStorm, all you'd have to do is get your terminal up. Find a directory you want to work in. So I'm going to go into WebStorm projects and use npx create react app, then whatever you want to call your app, and then -- template TypeScript. So that's all you'd have to do and hit enter. However, I'm not going to do that because I've done it this way. So there we go, happy hacking. And now you will see all the files that I need. We've got the tsconfig.json, we've got the package.json, and then we've got the source directory. I'm just going to go ahead and delete what we don't want. So we're not going to write any tests or anything like that. So I'm going to delete these two. So this app CSS and the test file. Then I'm going to also delete the logo. So let's go ahead and delete that. So just go ahead and click delete. And then we're going to also delete the report or vitals and setup tests, as we're not going to need those either. So delete those two. There we go. Okay. Great. So let's now have a look in my app TSX. I'm just going to pretty much delete everything so that we can start fresh. So there we go. Just delete all that. We don't really even need to import React. Let's change this to a functional expression just because that is my preference. So just like so. And then I'm just going to change the class name. Like so, and export default that component. Great. I'm going to delete everything from the CSS file. And in here, I'm just going to delete anything to do with testing or reporting web vitals. And I'm also going to delete these semicolons just because I don't really like using them at all. Okay, great. So this is what my index TSX will look like. This is what my app TSX will look like. And this is what my index CSS will look like. The next thing I'm going to do is actually first off, let's just create the UI first. This shouldn't take too long. I'm just going to create a few components. So I'm going to create a directory to keep all my components in. And in here, the components I'm going to create are going to be a code display. Okay, so we can see our code. Don't forget to use the extension TSX, as this is going to be a TypeScript file with JSX. And then I'm also going to create a messages display that'll hold all our messages, so messages plural. .tsx again, because we're going to have JSX in here. So just add that. And then I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to do this. It's going to be for one individual message. So message display.tsx. Great. So there we go. We've got 3 components, and I'm literally just going to copy this and I'm going to paste that in here like so. So into the code display. Let's change this to say code display, and then let's export that code display. And I'm just going to change this to say code display. Okay, let's do the same for messages display. So I'm going to copy all that, click on messages display, and this time I'm just going to change this to be messages plural. Messages plural. So that's what the component is called. And I'm going to call this messages plural display. And finally, for the message display, well, this is easy. I'm just going to make it not plural, so just singular on those 3 things. Great. So we've just created our 3 components. Let's go ahead and import them into the project. So on the app, well, I'm going to have a messages display first, because we want all the messages to display up here. So that has been imported for me automatically. So thank you very much. We're going into the components directory and getting the messages display component. We're going to pass stuff through into here, but for now, let's move on. I'm also going to have an input, okay, because we're going to have to want to, send queries over. So there is my input. It's going to take a value and it's going to have an onChange, but we'll do that when the time comes. Next, I'm just going to have the code display. So there we go. Let's see if that's automatically inserted, and it is. Great. And one last thing I'm going to have is just a div, and this is going to be for our buttons. So I'm going to give this the class name of button container, so it can hold our buttons. We're going to have 2 in here, so I'm going to have 1 button. Let's give this the ID of get query, because it's going to help us get queries. So get query just like so. And then another button, this one's going to be for clearing the chat. So I'm just going to paste that in, and let's give this the ID of clear chat. So we can style it up differently, and let's just change the text here to be clear chat. Great. So that is what it should look like. Now the messages display, so the plural, we're going to actually have a message display in here. So we're going to import message display from message display, as we're in the same place. We're here, right? So we just import it from here. So we don't need to go into the components or anything like that. And I'm actually going to map all the different messages onto one individual message display. Great. Now let's do a little bit of styling. So first off, what I'm going to do is say that everything in here, so everything in my entire project, is going to have the same font family. I'm going to go with Verdana. And then as a backup, let's just have Tahoma, and then let's have sans serif. Good old trusty sans serif. And the text is going to be RGB. This is a color I picked out. It's just essentially a very dark gray. You could almost mistake it for black. Next, I'm going to say that any P element, as well as the input, are going to have a specific font size. So I want them both to have the font size of 16 pixels. So that's what I have done. Next, I'm going to grab the whole body, and I'm just going to get rid of any default margin and padding, just to make sure that there's no lines around our document. So margin 0, padding 0. Okay, and now I'm going to center the app. So for this, I'm going to use display flex, initialize flexbox, which means that now I can use justify content center to center everything from left to right. And now I can also use align items center to center everything to top to bottom, so on the cross axis. But for this to work, I need to give this a height. So I'm going to go with 100 viewport height of the browser. And let's just go ahead and give this a background color as well. I'm going to go with far. And we should probably change this to be RGB, right? Because I think, let's try keep everything consistent. So 250, 250, 250. RGB 250, 250, 250. Great. And now let's actually grab the app itself. So we're going to use dot notation to get that class name. And the app is going to be 80 of the viewport height of the browser, and 80 of the viewport width. I'm also going to give it a background color. This time it's going to be white, so 255, 255, 255. Okay, let's also round it off a little bit, just slightly. Let's go with 10 pixels, just to not make it a harsh square. And let's also add a box shadow. Now my box shadow, I'm going to start off with being black but transparent. So A is for transparency. There we go, black. And we're going to put 0.1.6 for the transparency. And we're going to also put 0 x-axis, 1 pixel y-axis, and 4 pixels blur. Okay, so there we go. So at the moment, let's see what this looks like. In fact, let's go ahead and look at our start script. So if I do npm on start, it will start this. However, I actually want to add another script to start a backend. So start backend. Let's just make this a little bit bigger, which means that let's change this to be start frontend. Now, to start my backend in a TypeScript project, if I want to use type modules, I'm going to have to do ts node and then ESM, and then we're going to read the index TS file, which we haven't made. It's a TS file because we're not going to have any JSX in there. Okay, so make sure to have this if you want to add types, which I am going to do up here. So all I'm going to do is write type module so that we can import modules in our index.ts file. And by import, I mean we're not going to use require anymore. So that's two things you need to do. You need to do this and you need to do that. And we also need to import this package. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. Let's do so in here, making sure you are in the project npm I ts node. So that's going to go ahead and install. And while I am here, I'm also going to install cause and express, as I know I'm going to need those two. So great, that is now done. So now let's actually get to creating this index.ts file, which is going to essentially be our backend. So all I'm going to do is create a new file called index.ts. So there we go. Just make sure it's there in your project, so on the same level as the package JSON. So now to start my front end, I'm just going to grab this, and in the terminal, I'm going to do npm run start front end. And that should start up my front end, localhost 3000. There we go. That's what we've built so far. I'm just going to inspect this for now, just so we can see a little bit more of what is going on. Great. Let's carry on styling a little bit before we start adding the actual Meteor code. So let's go back here. I'm just going to minimize this for now. Get rid of that. Just get rid of that for now. Let's style our code display. So I'm just going to grab the code display just down here like so. And I'm going to give it a width of 96% of the parent, a margin of 2% to make up for the 100 taken from there, and a height of, let's just go 46%. Let's see how that looks. I'm also going to round it off. So let's give it a border radius of 8 pixels this time. And let's give it a background color. So again, I picked out this background color. I'm going to go with RGB 343434. Okay, great. And I'm also just going to hide any overflow. So overflow hidden. So at the moment, it will look like this. Let's also add that little, header with the 3 dots, just to make it look more like a little code display. So for that, what I'm going to do is, well, I'm going to go to the code display. So just here, and I'm going to add a div, and this is going to hold some buttons. So let's go ahead and give the class name of buttons, making sure to spell it correctly, of course. And let's add 3 buttons. So this div is going to have the class name of first button, or let's actually give them all the class name of button. That'll make more sense. So this is a button, this is a button, this is a button. This is going to be the first. So that's a separate class name, right? This is going to be middle, and this is going to be last. You can do first, second, third. It's up to you. Great. So that's what we're going to have. So those are the buttons. in my code display, and after the buttons, I'm also going to have another div. And this I'm going to actually style as well. I'm going to give this code output. And we're going to want to put our text, essentially, it's going to be a string, in here. Okay, so there we go. I think we are done with this for now. I'm just going to minimize this. Let's pick out the buttons first, and then the buttons, and so on. So let's just get rid of that. I'm going to minimize this too. And let's get the buttons class name. So just like so. Now my buttons, I want this to span the whole way. I'm also going to hard code a height, right? Because we don't really want this to change. And let's give it a background color of a slightly lighter gray. So there we go. And I want to make sure that all the buttons inside of it appear next to each other. And for that, I'm just going to use display flex. And I also want them to align in the center from top to bottom. So I'm going to use align items center, because we're going on the cross axis. Next, I also want the buttons, or anything inside the buttons display, to start a little bit from the left. So I'm going to give padding left 5 pixels. Great. So now let's pick out each button. Each button, I'm just going to actually make a button, so a circle essentially. I'm going to make sure it's 15 pixels, which means that the width needs to be 15 pixels because we're making a circle. Let's go ahead and do border radius 50%. And then let's also space all these out. So margin, let's go 4 pixels. So there's 4 pixels space around each one. Now, of course, if I was just to give this a background color of, let's go with red, just like that, and have a look. We get 3 little buttons, but I've also given them all separate class names, as you will see here, first, middle, and last. So I'm going to now change the color by grabbing these class names. So I can actually grab the element with the class name of button, and if it also has the class name of first, you'll see those are joined. I can choose a different background color. I'm going to go with RGB 2559686, and then let's do button middle it was, and let's change this to be 18945, and then let's do button last and change this to be 3820164. Okay, so there we go. This is looking great. Let's work on the messages display next. So all I'm going to do is get the messages plural display. So let's grab that. And I'm going to make sure that essentially it's the same width as the code display. And let's also, let's grab all that just so it's the same size exactly. And I'm also just going to add a scroll. So if there's more than messages that fit, I'm going to go overflow only on the y-axis. And I'm going to do scroll. So the little scroll should appear. Okay, wonderful. Now let's style each actual message. So each message is essentially just going to be kind of a square with rounded off edges. I want to take up 100% of the parent. So 100%. I want everything inside of it to appear from left to right, because I think we should have, a P element in here that will show you the user, and then another P element that will actually show you the message itself. And actually maybe a third one too, that's just going to show some kind of icon. So I want these to appear next to each other, right? So let's also give this a closing P tag. There we go. So that's 1, 2, 3. And if I want them to appear next to each other, that's why we did display flex. Great. Let's also round this off a bit. Let's do border radius 5 pixels. And I'm also going to do box sizing, border box, to make sure everything's on the inside. And then I'm also just going to change the background color to be the same background color as I think the body. Let's go ahead and do that. So I'm just going to paste in that like so. And now I'm also going to space out each message from each other, so each message block, by 5 pixels from the top and bottom and 0 from the left and right. So that is what that will do. Great. So if we look in here now, that is what a message will look like. And if I have many of these, so let's go and here, let's just pretend that we have loads and loads of messages all of a sudden. Okay, is that enough? Okay, you will see it's scrolling, but I'd actually quite like the scroll to always be there just because I want it to be really obvious that we can scroll. And to do that, what I'm going to do is back in here, I'm just going to add this little piece of code. So I've just taken this from the internet, was the messages display. Okay, and that will allow me to do that. It will be exactly the same visually, apart from it will always be there now. Great. So let's carry on. I'm actually going to give the message display, let's give this the ID of icon, just so we can pad it out a little bit. So I'm going to grab this and look for essentially any P element that also has the ID of icon, and I'm going to give the padding of this 0 from the top and bottom this time and 7 pixels from the left and right, just to pad it out from everything else that is going on here. So I padded that out. Okay, great. Now let's start the input. So once again, all I'm going to do is grab the input element. Okay, so the actual input, there's only one in our project, so I've just gone ahead and grabbed the whole thing. And essentially, let's kind of style it to look a little bit like a message. I'm going to go ahead and also use box sizing border box on the input. Let's give it a border of solid RGBA transparent. I'm going to go with black and then 0.16 and make sure that there's 1 pixels in width. Let's pad it out a little bit. So I'm going to do padding 16 pixels and a margin of 2%. Okay, so everything's got a margin of 2%. So that's what it looks like at the moment. Now, if I want this to kind of be centered, right, and fit exactly in the app itself, I'm going to have to use Flexbox on the app, which we didn't do. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm just going to initialize Flexbox, and then I'm going to center everything from left to right, and also make sure that everything's on top of each other by adding flex direction column. So that's what it looks like at the moment, all fits in the app nicely, and we've got that scroll action going on, and now we also have an input. Let's just round off the edges and finish styling off that input a little bit more. So I'm just going to go border radius 5 pixels, and that should be it. And finally, we're nearly done and we can get to the meatier stuff. Let's also just style these buttons up a little bit. So all I am going to do is just grab the button container, so the class name of button container. Again, I'm just going to give it a margin of 2%. I'm going to make sure that the buttons are next to each other, and I'm going to position them at the end by using justify content flex end. Okay, and now I'm going to say that any button that lives inside the button container, so that's what I've written just now, I'm going to make sure that the text is uppercase. So there we go. I'm going to pad each one out by 7 pixels, and I'm also just going to give it a border of none. And now if that button also has the ID of get query, I'm just going to change its color. So I'm going to go with background color RGB 2559586 to get that red that we used before. And as the border radius, I'm actually going to round off the top left 10 pixels, 0 on the top right, 0 on the bottom right, and 10 pixels on the bottom left. And now let's do the same for the clear chat button. Okay, so we're grabbing a button by the ID of clear chat. And now I'm going to swap this round. So we're going to go 0, 10 pixels, 10 pixels, 0. And let's make this yellow. So I'm just going to change these two to be 18945. Okay, great. And there we have it. There is our app. Now let's get to hooking it up. So for this, let's start off with the backend first. So let's just go ahead and go in here and let's set up our backend. So not the TSX file, the index.ts file that's not going to have any JSX. First off, I'm just going to put in my API key up here. We can, of course, move it out to an env file, but let's just get this working for now. Okay, so that is my API key just right there. I'm just going to move that down. Now let's define the port we want to run our backend on. I'm going to say 8000, and this is a number as we are writing in TypeScript, so we're going to have to start working with types. Before we move on, let's just go ahead and check our package JSONs look the same. So yours should look like this. I think we have everything in here that we need. Please go ahead and check this slowly. Okay, and let's not also forget to import the OpenAI package, as that is another one that we're going to need. So npmi OpenAI. Great. So let that do its thing, and then it should show up in here, which it has now done. Great. Let's carry on. Next, I'm going to import. So now we're using import express as well as two types. So application, request, and response from Express. So those are two things that we're going to have to do. We're also going to have to import cause from cause, as well as import two things from OpenAI, and that is configuration and OpenAI API. Okay. So there we go. Let's go ahead and reorder this to the top. So just like that. And I believe we need to also import the type cause. So let's go ahead and do that. npmi save dev type cause. So once again, let's just get up our terminal and do npmi save dev type cause. Okay, so that we can work with cause in TypeScript. And there we go. So if we now look in here, I'm just going to show you where that has gone. That's gone all the way down there. Great. Okay, so now let's actually get to using Express. I'm going to grab Express that we just imported and call it to release all of its wonderfulness. And let's save it as the const app. And this is where we use the application type that we just imported from Express. So we've got that now. Express now lives under the const app, which means that I can get app and use and pass cause through it and call it so that we don't get any cause error messages. I'm going to do the same for working with JSON. So I'm going to get Express and call JSON. So there we go. We can now work with passing JSON from the front end to the back end in this project. Great. Now from OpenAI, I'm going to essentially use these in order for us to communicate with OpenAI. But first we need to pass through our API key. So I'm going to create a new configuration, pass through an object that's simply going to have our API key. And we're just going to literally pass through our API key. And let's save this as const configuration, just like that, so you can use it later on. Now I'm going to essentially create a new OpenAI API and just pass through that configuration. So just pass it through into here and save this. You can save it as whatever you want. I'm going to save it as OpenAI so that we can use it later on. So great, we should now be authenticated. Let's get to writing our route to an endpoint. First off though, I'm going to listen out to any changes. So I'm going to pass through port. The port is 8000. I'm going to put a callback function that's just going to console log out. Your server is running on port and then the port. Okay, so that's all I'm going to do. So now let's write that route. It's going to be a post request as we have been working with. And then I'm just going to, let's make an endpoint. Let's just go ahead and make one up. You can call this whatever you want. Essentially now, if we visit localhost 8000/completions, then we're going to want to do something. And that is an async function. And we're going to pass through the request and the response. And then these have types that we did import from Express. So that's the request type and the response type. And now I'm going to try something and catch any errors. So catch error. And if there are any errors, I'm just going to console error, the error. I'm also going to send something over. So res status 500 error for error, and just send the text of server error. Okay, you don't have to, but that is what I have done. Great. So what do we want to try? Well, we're going to await the OpenAI create completion, or create chat completion to be precise. Let's save this as the const completion. And I'm going to pass through whatever we want to send to OpenAI. And that is the model that we want to use. In this case, it is GPT-4. And then the messages that we want to pass through as part of the chat. So the message should look like this. You need to put an array, and each message is symbolized by this little object right here, and it needs to have a role. So it's going to be the user, so us. And then whatever we pass through, we're going to be passing this through from the front end though. I'm going to pass that through the body as a message. So I'm just going to go ahead and do request body message. And because I want to only bring back stuff as SQL requests, so even if we type name my dog, I'm actually going to append some text here that says create a SQL request to, and then whatever we pass through. Okay, so everything will be turned into an SQL request. So that is a little cool hack for you to essentially change every single request that we send, but on the back end. Okay, great. And that should be part of the content. So I'm just going to put this maybe on a new line so it's easier to read for you. Okay, so that's my array, and here is one message that we're going to be sending over. And that's really it. So once we have the messages, so that's the whole object we are passing through, we're just going to send back whatever comes back as the completion. And we're going to go into the data, we're going to get the choices, and we're going to go into that array, get the first thing to come back and get its message. So that is just the format of the data coming back to us from the AI. I'm going to show you what this looks like as well. But first, let's get to hooking this up to the front end. So now here, let's just go ahead and make something happen on click of this. So on click, I'm just going to get query. And let's define our function get query. So const get query. And then I'm just going to define it up here. I'm going to try something and catch any errors. So just like we did previously. Catch error, console error, the error. And what shall we try? Well, we're going to actually use the fetch API from JavaScript, and we're going to fetch from HTTP localhost 8000, so our backend that we just created, / completion, so the endpoint that we just wrote. And of course, this is a post request. So we're going to have to pass through some options. So let's define those options. We can do so here. Const options equals. And then the method we're going to pass through is a post method. The body, well, we're going to pass it through JSON stringify. It says it's an object. And I'm just going to use the message. And let's just maybe hard code something for now. Let's go ahead and create a table. Okay, so we're just hard coding it at the moment. Let's also pass through some headers though. So headers, as we are working with JSON, I'm just going to pass through content type application JSON. Okay, so those are all my options that I want to pass through. And this is an async method, which means we need to use the await keyword, which also means that await can't live inside a function. It can only live inside async function. So we add the async keyword there. So we're going to wait for the response of this, and let's save this as something. I'm just going to go ahead and save it as a response. And then I'm just going to, for now, grab the response and get its JSON. So, that's also async, which means we need to await it. And once that comes back, let's just save this as data. So before we do much else, I'm just going to console log data just so we can see what's coming back to us. So there we go. Great, so we've now got the bare minimum to get this working. So let's go ahead and try this out. I'm just going to get the console log up to see if we get any errors. So now if I click on the button Get Query, we should essentially send this message, so with the request body message, to here, right? Request body message. So once again, this is the whole request. We're getting the body dot notation because there's an object message. And then we're sending that through to the OpenAI API with this appended to the front. And then we should get that message back. So let's go. Let's click Get Query. There has been an error. Let's check why. So we have not run our backend. So let's do npm run start backend and hit enter. So our server is now running on port 8000. And let's try this again. I'm just going to do that to clear this. So we've clicked on it. We are now waiting for our message to come back. And great, that is the message that comes back. Its role is from the assistant and the content is below is the SQL request to create a table called, and then we have the response. Great, so let's go ahead and show that in here, right? So let's go ahead and do that first. So now let's go ahead and go to the app.tsx file and let's use state in order to save to the state of the app. So I'm just going to import use state from React. Use state from React, just like so. And that means that I can save this. Let's save this chat. I'm going to go with const chat, set chat. And I'm going to start off with this being actually an empty array because we're going to have to add to that array. I just want to save all the chats that we have. And we know that our chat is going to come back with a role and content, right? So I'm just going to do this again so we can see. Okay, there's my object. It has a content and a role. So let's go ahead and define that interface up here. I'm going to go interface chat data. So one individual chat. It's going to have a role and that's going to be a string. And then content is also going to be a string. Okay, so I'm just defining the types up here. So that means that I can now use this interface to say that this will only take things in the array that look essentially like this object. Okay, so I have those types. So that is what I am doing. This is some TypeScript for you. Chat data. And make sure that's in an array. So only objects that look like this can go into this array now. Great. So now let's set chat. So once we get that back, we're console logging the data. I actually just want to set the chat, but I also want to not override the array. I want to add to the array. So for this, I'm just going to get the previous state. I'm just going to go ahead and call it old chat. You can call it whatever you like. I'm going to get that array. I'm going to spill out the old chat back into it. I'm going to pass through the new data. But along with that, I also actually, so I'm just going to show you what happens. I also want to actually save what we have been typing. So for this, I'm going to also have to save to state the value of a input. Because at the moment, we're just hard coding that here, right? I don't want that to happen. So let's go ahead and do const value of the input. I'm going to change it with set value. Let's do use state. And let's start off with it being an empty string. So let's also define this as being a string. This should only be a string ever at all times. So the value, we want to actually see that change in the input. So I'm just going to pass you the value, and on a change of the value, I'm going to get the event and I'm going to use set value to change it to whatever we are typing into the input. So that's how you would do that. Great. So now that means that instead of hard coding this, I could use the value of whatever we typed into the input to override that there. Okay, great. So I'm just going to show you if I console log value down here. So there we go. So I'm just going to type some stuff and it will change. So that is value, as you can see on app TSX line 35. So whenever I essentially click to get a query, I get the response back from the assistant, but I also want to save what I've been typing. So I'm going to actually create a new object. I'm going to call this user message, and I'm just going to construct an object that looks exactly the same as the chat response. So I'm going to have a role, and I'm also going to have content. But my role, I'm going to hard code as user because it's me, and the content is just going to be the value of what I've sent over. So that is now my user message, and I also want to pass that through into the set chat array. Great. So now if I console log chats, I'm just going to show you what that looks like. Let's just refresh so we clear that. Create a table for users. Get query. So it's empty at the moment. Our chat is empty. But what do we expect to happen? Well, I expect two objects to come back. One from the API with the role of assistant, and one that I added in the front end, right, with the role of user. And there we go. So indeed, we have the role from the assistant, and the assistant says, well, it's just giving us the text of how to create a table. And then me, I've hard-coded a user, and the content is exactly what I wrote in here. Wonderful. So we're saving all of that. If I was to write another one, then those two more objects should be saved in here. Each time we're saving two objects. So now let's use this data to display it. So all I am going to do is actually go ahead and, well, let's filter some of these messages, right? So I'm going to get the chat and I'm going to filter each message, so each object message. And I'm going to say if the message role equals user, then we know they're my messages. So let's say this is const filtered user messages, just like so. And now I'm just going to pass those filtered messages into the message display. So user messages is going to be the prop. I'm just going to pass your filtered user messages, which means that now on messages display, plural, I can pass that through. And as this is TypeScript, we're going to have to define those props. So interface messages display props. And well, we can actually also go further and define the user messages interface. So interface, so we're just defining what the object really looks like. User message has a role that is a string. Interface, and also content, right? That is a string. So we know that the user message is going to be an array of this. So user messages, so the prop user messages, right? The prop user messages is going to be a user message, but it's going to be an array of them. So that's what I've written there. So hopefully that makes sense. And now we could just use this to define the props we are passing through. So this will essentially say what types all our props have. We only have one prop, okay? And it's made up of those things in an array. Cool. So now we don't need to hard code this anymore. I'm actually going to get the user messages, okay? And I'm going to map. So I'm going to use .map to map each user message. Let's go with singular onto a message. display. Cool. We should really have a key here too. So I'm just going to use the index for this just because we don't want any errors showing up. Maybe I'll just put this on a new line. So I'm going to have a key that's essentially the index. And then I'm just going to pass through the message itself as the user message, which means we now need to go to the message display and pass down the message. Okay, so let's destructure the message. The message is easy because we know what it's going to look like. We can essentially just define the message props for this easily. So interface message display props. And the props for this, well, the message looks like this. It's an object that has a role. Or in fact, what we can do is just grab this user message again, paste it up here, and then just use the user message. Okay, we're just defining that even further. Interface. Great. So now let's grab those props and just do that. Wonderful. So this is looking so good. And now that we have each message with a message that has a role and content, I can grab the message and I can use curly braces and get the messages role and display it, and also get the messages content and display it. We are getting some curly lines here. Why is that? We seem to have missed a parenthesis, and there we go. So if we look in here now, we get the user and create table for users. Perhaps I don't really want that user showing up, but if you do, you can. I'm just going to comment that out for now. And there we go. I'm also just going to add in a text symbol for the icon itself. So here is my text symbol that I have chosen. If you want it to, I'm just going to show you where to get it from. You can essentially get it from here. So there is the URL if you want to get it. Great, so this is looking good. To create a table for users, create a table for dogs. I don't really know. Let's just go ahead and do that. And that should be added up here. And we are only saving the messages that have the role of user as we filter them out. Wonderful. So that's what I have done. Now this is looking so good. The next thing I want to do is just get the last possible content of the message that has the role of assistant to show up here. So let's go ahead and do that. So back on the app itself, I am actually going to filter once more because I'm going to have to filter out the chat. So let's get the chat, use filter once more to filter out each message. And if the message role this time equals assistant, so anything that comes back from OpenAI, I just want to get the very last one. So I'm just going to use pop, the method of pop, to get the very last one. And that's the latest. We can call it code, so latest code, even though technically it's a string. So once we have the latest thing that's come back to us from the AI, I'm simply going to pass that through. So the text that we're going to use for this is going to be the latest code. And we don't need its role. We just want its content. Okay, so we're going to display that, or if that doesn't exist, I'm just going to display an empty string. Cool. So now let's pass through the prop text on the code display. So let's get up our code display and let's pass that through. Okay, so this time we are not passing through the whole object. We're literally just passing through the string that's attached to the content. Right, we're going in here, we're filtering out everything by the role of assistant, so there should only be 2 items in our array, and then I'm literally just going dot notation content. So I'm passing through the last, this one, right? We're passing through the last one that came back to us. So let's define that prop interface code display props text string. Okay, so now we can just use that to define the types of our props. Wonderful. And now I can just get that text and display it in here. So there we go. Latest code is possibly undefined. That is fine. Let's check if it exists. And then also this needs to be content. Great. So that should show up. However, I feel that we haven't changed the text of this. So let's just change the color of this text. So on the code display, let's actually get the code output as well. Where was the code related stuff? Code display. I'm also just going to grab the code output. Let's give it a margin of 20 pixels. And I'm also going to say that any P element that lives inside the code output is going to have a different text color. And I'm just going to make it the yellow that we have been using. So 255.189.45. Great. So there we go. That is now showing up. We've nearly done it. The last thing we'll do is just clear the chat. So let's write a function for that. So let's go ahead and do that here. On click, this is going to be super easy. I'm just going to clear chat and let's define that up here. Const clear chat. There we go. All I'm going to do is set the value to be an empty string again. So let's just put that in here and pass through an empty string. And I'm going to set the chat to be an empty array again, so we can start fresh. So let's check that out. Let's do this here. Let's get that query, and that should be saved up there as part of our history. Okay, that is wonderful. And we also get the query to do this. Let's do create a table called users and get that query. So once again, that should do its thing. And there we go. Let's go ahead and do a few more. Update the table to have phone numbers. Okay, so that hasn't done it, but it's given us some instructions. And add a fake user to the table users. And there we go, and it's shown us how. And we can, of course, scroll through all of this. And if I click on clear chat, that has cleared our chat for us. Great. One final thing we're going to do, just to make sure that everything is safe, is just create a .env file so we can keep our API key safe. So let's add that in here. Let's do API key equals, and let's get it from the backend. So index TS. There we go. And I'm just going to grab this. It is a string, so that is implied. I'm going to use process env to look in that .env file and get the API key. So that's what we have done. And then in the API key here, I'm just going to save that in here like so. So we are done with this, and we're just going to have to import the .env package. Okay. So once again, I'm just going to get on my terminal and I'm going to do npm i.env. Just like so. Okay, and great. And finally, we just need to import that up here. So import like so, and then let's get .env and get config and call it. Okay, in order to use it. And great, that's it. I hope you've learned a lot. I've really enjoyed showing you how to do this in TypeScript. So I hope you had fun, and I hope to see you again soon.